President Trump lashing the media today in a series of tweets, calling out journalists for their Trump derangement syndrome and pointing out that 90% of media coverage of him is negative. I think he's got a point, don't you? Evening, everyone, and welcome to The Next Revolution. I'm Steve Hilton, and this is the home of positive populism. Here with us, live in Los Angeles, Jason Chaffetz and Tomi Lahren. We have a great show for you tonight, including a can't-miss Swamp Watch exposing China's corrupt influence on the elitist political class in Washington, D.C. But first, I got back from a family RV trip late last night. Yes, there'll be pictures later in the show, and wanted to catch up on all the news. So this morning, I watched the Sunday shows on the other networks, to make sure I was across all the important developments.
Good morning, and thanks for joining us this Sunday. This week, we saw just how Michael Cohen's knowledge of the president's past could determine Trump's future.
Let me start with the Michael Cohen situation.
Anthony, thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate it. I want to start with Michael Cohen.
Well, I do not want to start with the Michael Cohen situation. In fact, I don't want to waste your time with Michael Cohen at all, because this endless, ridiculous, crazed Russia obsession of the political and media establishment has literally zero impact on your life. What does have an impact on your life? The fact that we've just hit 4.1% growth. The fact that what's driving that is a massive boom in business investment. The fact that this is leading to higher productivity and, most importantly, higher incomes for working Americans. That's what we should be talking about, not just to pat ourselves on the back, but to make sure we keep things moving in the right direction and don't go back to the bad old days, the bad old decades of wage stagnation for the workers at the same time as skyrocketing riches for the elite. We need to be clear about why this turnaround is happening, because we have an unashamedly pro-enterprise president in the White House and a Republican majority in Congress. And no, it's not just the tax cuts, including the corporate tax cut, although that was absolutely vital. It's the deregulation, it's the energy policy, it's the massive change in the whole climate of policymaking that has led to a surge in business confidence. All of that goes into reverse if the Democrats win power. There was a time when the Democrats were centrists, wanting to be seen as pro-business. Not anymore. They're lurching off to the loony left. There was a time when Democrats were populists for the workers. Not anymore. They're pandering to their activist base, backing policies that hurt American workers, like open borders. If the Democrats get in, everyone knows what will happen. Taxes go up, the economy goes down. President Trump was elected for one reason above all, to get the economy moving after decades of elitist failure. That's why so many people supported him, even if they didn't love his language or his behavior or his tweets. Well, he's delivering his side of the bargain, faster and bigger than perhaps even his supporters expected. That's why his opponents in the elite and in the media don't want to talk about it. They'll do anything to distract and deflect from the economic turnaround, which is why we saw their favorite tactic deployed this morning: gin up their elitist base with Russia conspiracy dog whistles. They do not care about you or your life. In their rich, comfortable, elitist bubble, they're detached from the stresses of working Americans and puffed up with their own smug self-importance. High-end TV dramas set in Washington, D.C., like House of Cards and Scandal, have completely gone to their heads. They think they're glamorous participants in some high-minded game, not mere journalists reporting the news. If the news contradicts their elitist narrative, well, they just don't report it. Real people in the real world, many millions of them, are seeing life get better for the first time in a long time. But the IYIs, intellectual yet idiot, in our ruling class simply don't care. They should remember something, to paraphrase that famous phrase of Bill Clinton's aide. It's the economy, idiots. Tell me what you think of all that at NextRevFNC and at Steve Hilton X. Now, here to discuss, Fox News contributor Tomi Lahren and former Utah Congressman, Fox News contributor and author of the new book, The Deep State: How an Army of Bureaucrats Protected Barack Obama and is Working to Destroy the Trump Agenda, Jason Chaffetz. So, Tomi, two things really there. Good news on the economy. The media's ignoring it. take your pick which one.
Well, of course, those are tied together. So we have good news about the economy. Trump derangement syndrome sets in full force, and they don't want to talk about all the great things this president is doing for average everyday Americans. So they have to talk about Michael Cohen day in and day out. And like you said, the average American does not care about that. But the Democrats, all they have is Trump derangement syndrome, Russia, and identity politics. And now they've got their new stars, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Bernie Sanders. They're out there, have no idea what they're talking about with their democratic socialism. So, of course, they're going to talk about Michael Cohen. They can't talk about themselves. They can't talk about the economy. What are they left with?
I know, it's just unbelievable. It's just like, it just keeps coming back. I feel like, are we ever going to get rid of this Russia thing? I mean, ever?
Well, that's the only thing in their playbook. By the way, that RV trip must have done you well, because I love that opening. They can only talk about that thing because when they don't have a policy to point to, then what do? Distract, talk about something else. They don't have leaders because they want Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer back in there, and they want to raise your taxes, open up the borders, and do all those things that America figured out didn't work over the last few decades. But fortunately, Donald Trump, he goes over the top, he talks to them through social media, and I think America's figured it out. And
the other thing on the economy is, like, I have seen a couple of them say, well, yes, okay, 4.1% fine, but it's not real. I've heard the phrase, it's a sugar rush. This is just the tax cuts leading to quick sort of surge in consumer spending or whatever. But the data shows a very different story. Like I said, it's actually a really serious investment-led recovery that's going on here.
Not enough credit or discussion is given to the relaxation of the regulations. You combine, it's unbelievable what Donald Trump has done.
This didn't just start in whenever it was January when the tax cut bill was thing. It's been going on since pretty much
regulations, the tax cut. I can tell you though, Steve, the one thing that they have to do in Congress, they have to curb spending. We've got the equation all right, except the spending part of it. Our debt cannot be that much out of control. It really is a serious issue.
So do you think that in the end might be a threat to the good economic news?
I do. When you're over $20 trillion, we're going to be spending more than $1 billion a day just in interest on the national debt. That's how big it is.
But tell me the other thing that is just really astonishing. When you think about all the lectures we had from people like Bernie Sanders and others about the rigged economy and working people, whatever, it's literally that, again, the data shows that for the first time in a really long time, wage incomes for regular working Americans are going up after decades of being flat.
Well, when you hear people like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez talking about those things, they're using talking points, which they've demonstrated they have actual no knowledge of the economy and what's happening. If you watch some of the clips of their new shining star, you'll know that she has no idea what she's talking about. But they use these talking points, want to help the poor, want to help the working class. We want fair incomes. We want a living wage. We want everyone to pay their fair share. But if they actually look at the numbers, the very people that they want to support, the very people that they want to bring up are being helped by President Donald Trump. That's right. And that's why they're so agitated. They hate it. They hate to see this president win. They hate to see Americans win because it's bad for them when it comes to midterms and it's bad for them when it comes to 2020. Great for the American people.
I think that's right. And, that's what over the last, couple month or so, I think they would have thought, look, we've got him on the back foot. The border issue, as we've discussed here, that was not the finest hour for the administration. Then you saw Helsinki, a lot of criticism there. Now you got this good news to change the subject, and then we'll go straight back to Russia.
Well, but then,
that's what they've,
And so then they said, well, the foreign policy isn't going well. Then they wanted to try to attack President Trump on the tariffs. But look what happened with the EU suddenly comes to the table, and now we're talking about bringing them down to zero. So every ball is bouncing in the right direction. Donald Trump is a disruptive president. He's doing it differently. He's not doing it with the elitists. He's not doing it with the establishment, not doing it with inside the Beltway people, but it's working.
What do you think about the within the Republican Party, the kind of never Trump crowd? I mean, how are they seeing all this?
I think they're really having to swallow hard because the economy is actually working. I think the people, as we go into the midterms, that are going to struggle are going to be those that waffled with the president. If they waffled early on, they have a chance here in the last 90 days before they actually start to cast ballots and say, you know what? I am with the president on this. I mark my word, after the election day, the Republicans that lose will be the ones that waffled on the president. They couldn't support him on immigration. They couldn't support him on tariffs. They couldn't support him on the economy. And they will be that wishy-washy middle that loses.
Steve, I was going to say to that, I think that the rhinos in Congress and in leadership positions, I think they're more vulnerable than the Democrats are. And in fact, I think that they're even more concerned about the winning of this president than some of the Democrats on board. I think it terrifies them because what this president does is he makes them and their elitist mentality irrelevant, because he says, look what you guys have been doing for this long, and I'm able to come in and change things in a matter of 2 years. And they're terrified because they are becoming irrelevant. Yeah. John McCain, I'm talking to John McCain specifically.
And the other thing about that is that what they just, I think, can't stomach is that there's a substantive core to President Trump and his agenda. They may not like it, but you know, all that stuff they threw at him. Oh, he's not serious, and he's a celebrity, and whatever. He's been on TV. He's actually got more of a substantive agenda that is being implemented and making a difference than they've had for a long time.
He's actually had to hire and fire people and run businesses. And once they understand that we elected this president to get something done, not to be nice, maybe they'll understand the success of this president and they'll get on board. But I'm not going to hold my breath.
So on the Russia thing, I just wanted to ask you quickly, do you think that we're going to see the Mueller thing, anything happen shortly, or is it going to linger on through the midterms, do you think?
I think, unfortunately, it's going to continue to linger on. I mean, we've seen no evidence to date, but you have people like Adam Schiff and whatnot that will continue to try to stir the drum. But every time things have come up, he's been discredited, and the release of the memos and things like that. One key thing that's out there is that Inspector General, Michael Horowitz, is looking at the FISA abuse and what happened within the bowels of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The real collusion is Hillary Clinton and her DNC and the Clinton campaign funneling money that ends up in the hands of Russians, which ends up in a dossier, which ends up being the catalyst to spy on another campaign.
And at that point, they won't be so excited to talk about Russia. I can promise you that. Thank you both. Good discussion. While the elite obsess about Russia, they have actually been selling America out to China. Swamp Watch exposes the details later in the show. But next, the president had a good meeting this week with the EU leader, and some surprising news from that is right after the break. President Trump met with EU leader Jean-Claude Juncker this week to talk trade and tariffs. The president's economic advisor, Larry Kudlow, today revealed a fascinating offer from the EU. Take a look.
Europeans came, by the way, right at the top with an offer to purchase tons and tons of American soybeans. They don't have tariffs on them. They just said, we will buy them from you. This is a contentious issue because of China's soybean tariffs, and that's to the point you made earlier. Our farmers would prefer trade, not aid, but they've been stuck. I think soybean prices have already started to firm up in the commodity markets.
So this is really interesting, Jason, because you touched on it earlier. You've got the president under fire from his critics for the trade measures against China, and they're saying, oh, look, they're firing back on soybeans, that's going to hurt Trump supporters and the farmers and so on. And then the EU, who he's also being very aggressive with, coming in with an offer to help out on the soybeans issue. Isn't this all an example of how this whole trade thing is a negotiation, and the leverage and the pressure that he's putting there is yielding results?
Yeah, well, he is. What President has figured out, and he knew a long time ago, is that you got to be willing to walk away from the table. And we got to take maybe a little short-term pain in order to get the long-term win. There have been some allegations that the Chinese have been targeting literally congressional districts where there are members that would feel the heat on tariffs. But the president, I think, has held the line. And sure enough, now the EU is coming to the table, and the president's calling everybody's bluff, saying, all right, you want to trade with the United States of America? Let's have no tariffs on either side. Then we'll play head-to-head, and the United States will win.
That's right. And in fact, one of the other points that Larry Kudlow made in that interview was that actually, instinctively, the president is a free trader. He wants no tariffs. He wants to get rid of all these barriers. That's where he'd like to get to, but it's a process, and he's just at the beginning of it.
Every time this president comes to the table from a position of strength, he wins. We've seen it in foreign policy over and over again. Economics, no different. And again, when we're talking about what this president has been able to do, in a matter of a week, the whole conversation has changed pretty significantly. So that just shows you that this president believes in American exceptionalism, and he knows that the world needs the United States more than the United States needs the world in many cases. But what you're seeing with the EU is if the EU and the United States can come together and put pressure on China, that's a win for everybody. Nobody's been able to do it. So people that are upset, that are groaning about these short-term burdens look at what we've done for the past, how long? Nothing's worked. So we have to try something else.
Well, that's the other point that he made, I thought was a really good point, which is don't blame President Trump for all this. He's responding to a totally broken trading system, and he's trying to fix it.
And part of what the president has done is used liquid natural gas, LNG, you heard that talked about a lot.
Yep.
We're able to ship that because we have more than Saudi Arabia has oil. We have liquid natural gas. And we've got to be able to put that into the European market so that the Germanys and the Poles and everybody doesn't have to rely upon Russia.
Exactly.
And Russia's just a gas station. They got a lot of land and they've got some oil. And so if we can disrupt that and help drive down the cost, guess what? They can't do what they're doing in Syria. They can't do what they're doing with the Iranians. It's the key to everything, and the president understands this.
Do you think, Tommy, that I mean, you're in touch with the kind of what you might call the Trump base and the real sort of fervent supporters? This story that's being told that, they're really getting angry with him over the tariffs thing, do you recognize that? What's your take?
Well, I'm from an agricultural state originally.
Yeah.
I'm from South Dakota, so I understand that there are some farmers, especially small farmers, that are a little bit worried, but I think they trust this president. I think that they know that his strength is something to be reckoned with, and I think that they know that he's going to take care of them. As we saw in the piece, of course, the farmers would prefer trade, not aid. Everybody knows that. But to get them over this hurdle, this president's doing what he has to do to protect them, to make sure that their livelihoods are somewhat shielded. But I believe that the Trump base looks at this president and says he's been able to win over and over and over again, despite everybody tearing him down. I think that they're going to have the same confidence, and they're going to wait and watch it work. I hope that they have trust in this president.
And of course, the other thing is this is not a mystery that's suddenly been sprung on the American people.
No.
This is delivering a promise. He was so clear that this is how he was going to do it all, right?
They hate when he keeps his promises. He's the only president that's attacked for doing exactly what he said he was going to do. Everyone else is scrambling because they don't know how that works in D.C. to do what you say you're going to do.
Right.
That's not the norm.
I know, there you go.
Well, you're saying one thing, but you're supposed to do something else.
So, Jason, look, I'm not going to ask you. I've got a suspicion, Tommy, that you have not met Jean-Claude Juncker. I don't suppose your paths have crossed, but Jason, there's a chance that you have. Have you ever met this guy?
No, I would. If I met a Juncker, I would remember it. I don't.
Okay, there you are. So the reason I ask is because one of my favourite stories. I think we might have the footage. Like his nickname in Europe when I was is Jean-Claude Drunker, because he was literally a notorious drunk who would show up to meetings and with people I know would describe how he'd have the smell stinking of booze in sort of morning meetings. Of course, they deny it. He said this.
Oh, he looks perfect.
No, but they're saying that's not because he is drunk. He had sciatica. So we must get that in. That's their story. But I was just wondering whether you'd ever encountered this issue face to face. Breath to breath.
There have been some people you smell a little alcohol on their breath.
Maybe that's why
I don't drink any, so when it happens, I come.
Maybe that's why the meeting went so well. Who knows? I think we're going to leave it there before the lawyers get really upset. Swamp Watch takes on China, and you can't miss it. That's still ahead. But next, it's one of the biggest themes of my new book, Positive Populism. How do we put power back in the hands of the people? Our next guest has a revolutionary idea for how to do that. But does everyone agree with it? We'll have a heated debate right here after the break. Welcome back, everyone. My new book, Positive Populism, is available for you to pre-order if you haven't already. There it is. You can head to positivepopulism.org to get it. One of the central ideas in it is decentralizing power, taking it out of the hands of the federal government and bureaucrats and giving it back to you, the people. One effort to do just that has been something that we've talked about here on this show, and it's in the book as well, the Convention of States. Joining me now, the president of the Convention of States Project, Mark Meckler. Mark, good to see you. Thank you for joining us. We've talked about this before on the show, but just in case some of our audience didn't catch that the first time round, I'd love you just to set out, as simply as you could, what is the Convention of States Project?
Sure. In Article 5 of the United States Constitution, the power for the people to get together state by state and call a convention, takes 34 states to do so, for the purpose specifically of restraining the scope, power, and jurisdiction of the federal government. It's set forth there in Article 5. The Convention of States Project is designed to use Article 5 of the Constitution to call a convention, to get delegates from all over the country together, to do just that, to propose amendments that would take away the power from the federal government and give it back to the people in the states as you described.
So that phrase, take it away and give it back to the people, that sounds great. A lot of people would agree with that. I certainly do. What specifically would that look like? What would be written in the amendments that would achieve that end?
Sure. Well, this application is done on what's called a subject matter basis. There are 3 subject matters that can be discussed at convention. The first is anything that would put fiscal restraints on the federal government. That would include things like a balanced budget amendment, imposing generally accepted accounting principles, imposing tax and spending caps on the federal government. The second area is anything that would impose term limits on the federal government. That would include both elected and appointed officials, so that would be Congress as well as the federal judiciary, including the Supreme Court, and I think importantly, the bureaucracy. And finally, the most important clause, I think, and the most important discussion that can be had is about taking power away from the federal government by restraining their scope or their jurisdiction. In other words, saying that there are things that the federal government may not be engaged in, for example, education and energy and the EPA, things like that.
But that's okay. That's interesting. Again, I agree with that. But that's already in the Constitution. The 10th Amendment, that already, whatever, I can't remember the exact phrase, but it's, powers not explicitly given to the federal government, are reserved for the states and the people. But that has been completely ignored. So how would this change? Education being a great example, or healthcare is another one.
Well, I think
how would this change that?
I think you're hitting on the key point, which is when most of us think of the Constitution, Steve, we're thinking of maybe the pocket Constitution we carry around, the original one in the National Archives. Today, the Constitution, if you were to order it from the government printing office, and I have a copy sitting on my desk, it's 2,738 pages, not counting the more recent supplements. This is every Supreme Court case that has ever attempted to tell us what that Constitution actually means. I know you've read it. It's a fairly simple document. It's outrageous that it takes 2,700 pages of Supreme Court jurisprudence. And the reality is what they've done is dramatically expand the scope and the power of jurisdiction of the federal government. And the way the founders gave us to limit that, to carve back on what the Supreme Court has done, is Article 5.
I just want to really make sure we're all clear about that point. You're saying that the real agent behind the expansion of the federal government, or the enabler maybe is a better word, of the federal government's powers, has been the Supreme Court.
Absolutely. Let me give you a very specific example. In the 1930s, there was a case by the name of Wickard v. Filburn, and that case said, it ruled ultimately that a man who grew wheat for his own consumption was engaged in interstate commerce. Interstate commerce and the power to regulate that was given to the federal government is supposed to be very narrow, to regulate the movement of goods across state lines. Well, he engaged in no such commerce, but they said because he was growing wheat, he didn't buy wheat, so they could regulate him. In other words, business, not doing business, becomes business, and the federal government can regulate absolutely everything. That's an outrageous interpretation of the Interstate Commerce Clause. Only an Article 5 convention can restrict that interpretation.
All right. Well, Mark, would you just stay with us? So we'll come back to you in a second. What do we think about this?
I hate it. I hate it. I absolutely think it's a disastrous. I don't believe that the Constitution is a living, breathing document that needs to just go to convention. Hey, let's go change the whole thing.
That's very dangerous.
It's a very dangerous way to go. When you talk about it from just a conservative viewpoint, hey, there's some conservative things that sound like it would be a good idea, but put forth an amendment, the only way to do that is not through a convention of the states. You can also do that through Congress. But one of the things that these guys are talking about is reconfiguring the court, the Supreme Court, so that there's one from every state. They want 50 Supreme Court justices on a rotating basis. What could go wrong with that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think it sounds good in theory, but I think in practice it would be a disaster. Look at the difficulty that we have with our existing Constitution and our existing government. Everybody believes in deregulation, and everyone believes that the Supreme Court has, in some cases, overstepped its bounds. But I think the best way to combat that is exactly what this president is doing by deregulating. And also, look at the Supreme Court. We have an incredible opportunity. We were given one with Neil Gorsuch. We have another one coming up very shortly. So I think that's the best way to go about this. That sounds like an utter disaster. And would you like to see California try to do that? No.
Okay, let's go. I promised a heated debate. Let's have one. Mark, come back at them.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I would ask Jason and Tommy if they understand who they're standing with. Every single radical, leftist, Marxist, communist group in America has stood against this. George Soros, Hillary Clinton personally has spoken out against this.
How about Senator Mike Lee? Senator Mike Lee's against it.
Hold on a second. Let me finish, Jason. Let me finish. Jason, let me finish, and we'll finish. Over 250 radical groups, Planned Parenthood, La Raza, MoveOn.org, Common Cause, every leftist group, Hillary Clinton against this. If you look at people like Steve Hilton has spoken out in favor of it, Sean Hannity, Glenn Beck, Mark Levin, Randy Barnett from Princeton, or from... So all of these people, every major conservative figure in America, scholar or television personality has spoken out on it. Senator Tom Coburn.
No, that's not true.
Okay,
let's just do it. Make sure everyone can hear. If you just hang on a second, Mark. Jason, you go with that point about the allies against this are not company you'd want to be in.
I just would argue that every single conservative person has spoken out on this. I disagree. I'd point to my friend and former colleague.
I did not say that.
Mark. So, Mark, please.
I would point to, for instance, Senator Mike Lee. There are a lot of people out there that are opposed to this. It scares them. The idea that you don't know what the rules are going to be if you have one of these. And that's what's dangerous about this. I don't believe getting this group together to reconfigure the Constitution with some 20-plus amendments that are at least formalized in one degree or another out there is necessarily the recipe. And I appreciate that conservatives want to have more conservative judges and a more conservative approach, that the federal government is overreaching. I am totally on board, but I don't think a convention of the states is the right way to do it.
Tommy, and then last word to Mark.
No, I agree with Jason wholeheartedly. I think that it sounds great in theory. That's why many prominent conservatives have probably come out in favor of it, at least in part. I'm sure that's why, because deregulation sounds great to all of us, but in practice, it sounds like a disaster. It sounds like a mess, and it sounds very dangerous. They mentioned all the leftist groups that are against it. It might not be because it's a conservative idea. It might just be because it's a bad idea, and we're all in agreement that it's a bad idea.
Sorry, Mark, very quickly. We don't have too much time. Just a quick final thought, please.
Very specifically, what all of these liberal groups have said.